background to what I shall be talking about, I'd like to mention that having retired only a few years ago, I was studying an Open University BA course with a strong musical component. The theme for the final year was words and music, and it covered several centuries and quite a number of different genres. At the end of the year, rather than having a formal exam, we were asked to produce a rather longer than normal essay, and given tutorial approval, we could select our own subject matter, provided it was related to words and music. Having thought about this for a while and reflecting the fact that I greatly enjoy Elgar's music and am also a Gilbert and Sullivan addict, I decided to compare the ways in which the two composers set about putting words to music. Now, understandably, I think it was necessary to concentrate on two particular compositions. In Elgar's case, I felt this had to be the Dream of Gerontius, but selecting something from Sullivan's considerable output was rather more difficult. I mean, it was certainly true that he wrote quite a few serious works, such as the Martyr of Antioch and the Golden Legend, not to mention a perfectly decent symphony and also a cello concerto. But thinking along the lines of compare and contrast, I decided that one of the Savoy operas would be appropriate. And then, for no better reason than once, long ago, I had sung the part of Bunthorne in Patience, I selected that. The high spot for me of researching for this longer than normal essay was being allowed access to the D'Oyly Carte archives, which, at the time I'm talking about, were housed in something rather like a garret, fairly close to the Oval Cricket Ground. And I am very pleased, and I think not a little relieved, to say that they are now safely lodged in the British Library. And also at this stage, it's worth, I think, acknowledging that while Patience was an instant success, Gerontius was not. Now, depending on who one consults, England in the 19th century was either a land without music or one with far too much. And the former view was held by supposedly knowledgeable people in Europe, while the latter sentiment was homegrown. And in 1877, no less a person than John Ruskin went on record as saying, "The less we compose at present, the better. There is good music enough." And I do wonder if Elgar knew about that when he quoted Ruskin's other comment, "This is the best of me," on the score of Gerontius. However, from the, I suppose, the mid-1860s onwards, there was a rebirth of British music and a well-developed interest, which, thanks to Sullivan, Elgar, Vaughan Williams, and so on, still exists. Indeed, Percy Young, no less a person than Percy, had written that what he called the Renaissance of home-composed music started with the English premiere of Sullivan's incidental music to Shakespeare's play The Tempest. And before starting a comparison of different word-setting techniques, it might be worth listening to an extract of what the 19-year-old composer wrote as his graduation piece from the Leipzig Conservatoire, and which was given its English premiere at the Crystal Palace under the baton of August Mans in April 1862, and it was an immediate success. That recording is Richard Hickox and the BBC Philharmonic Orchestra. Now, to put things into perspective, I want to say something about the biographical backgrounds of those concerned: Gilbert, Sullivan, Newman, and Elgar. And first of all, Gilbert. He was the older member of the Savoy Partnership, having been born in 1836, and he wrote verses for Fun, which was a punch-type magazine, and included in these were what were known as the Bab Ballads. He also wrote satirical burlesques and stage plays. He also qualified as a barrister, though he wasn't a particularly successful one. And by the time he was introduced to Sullivan in 1869, he was already regarded as a successful figure in London theatre land. Their first joint venture was Thespis in 1871. That unfortunately did not catch on, but the partnership under the controlling influence of Richard Dorley Cart gained momentum with Trabajori in 1875. On the other hand, Sullivan, like Elgar, came from fairly lowly stock. His father was a musician, mainly in army service, first of all as a bandsman at the Royal Military College of Sandhurst. Sandhurst was a college in those days, not an academy. And then as a professor of trombone, tuba and clarinet at the Royal Military School of Music in Kneller Hall. After some time as a chorister in the Chapel Royal, the young Sullivan studied at the Leipzig Conservatoire from 1858 until 1861 as the first holder of the Mendelssohn Scholarship. Once back in England, he became a church organist, developed his fame as a composer, including producing a symphony, quite a decent cello concerto, and a great deal of incidental music. In his private life, Sullivan was a much welcomed social climber, of whom must be said he was rather more than just fond of the ladies. Born 4 decades before either Gilbert or Sullivan, John Henry Newman was a leading Tractarian in the Church of England who converted to Roman Catholicism and duly became a cardinal. He was a deep thinker, and his poem The Dream of Gerontius, written following the death of a close friend, was immensely popular during Victorian times. I dare to suggest that nowadays it really is only known as the source of words for Elgar's Dream. The youngest member of the quartet is, of course, our man Edward Elgar. As a personality, he was very much the opposite of the older gregarious Sullivan and faced much difficulty in rising above his modest family background and his Roman Catholic faith. He was very much au fait with Newman's poem, and despite accumulating a wide range of well-placed and influential friends, he always regarded himself as something of a musical outsider. Let's now start looking at Sullivan's and Gilbert's work. Patience, the 6th joint effort, and from its premiere in April 1881, it was a great success and ran to no fewer than 578 performances. The plot was based on one of Gilbert's Bab Ballads, which was originally titled The Rival Curates. However, he was rather chary of pillorying the church on the stage, so rewrote the story as a satire on the contemporary aesthetic cult led by personalities such as Swinburne, William Morris and Oscar Wilde. It tells the rivalry between two poets for the affections of some well-bred young ladies who, until a year previously, had all been engaged to officers in the army, and the cavalry no less. They were also interested in the attentions of gaining the attentions of Patience, the village milkmaid. The many different, I feel, splendid patter songs for characters in Patience provided plenty of scope for Sullivan to write music directly describing each of the group of protagonists: lovesick maidens, soldiers, aesthetes, and the milkmaid. and his music portrayed the characteristics of the individuals, but didn't necessarily advance the overall storyline. Unfortunately, he was constrained by having to write for an ordinary theatre orchestra comprising a limited range and a limited number of instruments, usually just about 22 or 23, and including cornets rather than trumpets, as John Owen Edwards marked on his conducting score when making the recording that I shall be using later today. But I think it's fair to say that Sullivan's instinctive wit and musicianship largely overcame that handicap. To illustrate the personal music, here is the Lament of the Lovesick Maidens. This recording was made in 1993. It was a concert performance at King's College School, Wimbledon, featuring the D'Oyly Carte Orchestra and Chorus. And I think we can compare that with the Allegro martial chorus that followed shortly afterwards, The Soldiers of Our Queen, which could well have come straight from the Santa's parade ground. And the same comment applies to a subsequent song sung by one of the characters, Colonel Calverley, which starts off with the words, "When I first put this uniform on." And the singer here is Donald Maxwell.
It's one little the endless if I finger and forms a pass. So the lace the sounds of fair, and a fact that I counted upon when I first put this uniform on. A simple coincidence you could never have counted upon. The same thing occurred to me when I first put this uniform on. I said when I first put it on, it is plain to the veriest dunce that every beauty will feel it her duty to yield to its glamour at once. They will see that I'm filigo-laced, in a uniform handsome and chaste, but the peripatetics of long-head aesthetics are very much more to their taste, which I never counted upon when I first put this uniform on. A simple coincidence you could never have counted upon. I didn't anticipate that when I first put this uniform on.
Excellent patter songs, which I think is more an accompanied recitative than anything else. And both the words and the music really amply portray the character of the poet Bunthorne, who, depending on who one listens to, was based on either Swinburne or Wilde. The words in particular show that Bunthorne is a fraud. This time the singer is Simon Buttress, a worthy successor to such D'Oyly Carte comic masters as George Goldsmith, Henry Lytton, Martin Green, Peter Pratt, and relatively more recently, John Reed.
Am I alone and unobserved? I am. Then let me own I'm an aesthetic sham. This air severe is but a mere veneer. This cynic smile is but a wile of guile. This costume chaste is but good taste misplaced. Let me confess, a languid love for lilies does not blight me. Lank limbs and haggard cheeks do not delight me. I do not care for dirty grins by any means. I do not long for all one sees that's Japanese. I am not fond of uttering platitudes in stained glass attitudes. In short, my medievalism's affectation, born of a morbid love of admiration. If you're anxious for to shine in the high aesthetic line as a man of culture rare, you must get up all the germs of the transcendental terms and plant them everywhere. You must lie upon the daisies and discourse in novel phrases of your complicated state of mind. The meaning doesn't matter if it's only idle chatter of a transcendental kind. And everyone will say, as you walk your mystic way, if this young man expresses himself in terms too deep for me, why, what a very singularly deep young man this deep young man must be.
Gilbert's topsy-turvy approach, Sullivan significantly changes Bunthorne's musical style in Act 2. And this is a cue to mention Archibald Grosvenor, an idyllic poet, dramatic lightweight, and Bunthorne's bête noire. His songs, such as Prithee Pretty Maiden and Though to Marry You, are distinctly designed to appeal to a Victorian parlour audience. Likewise, the nonsense of the more rhythmic A Magnet Hung in a Hardware Shop in Act 2. Turning to the female characters, Patience, the milkmaid, has basically a soubrette role, and her music reflects this. Her opening song with its condenser, I Cannot Tell What This Love May Be, scarcely deserves to be called an aria. It's nothing more than a melodious pastiche of earlier 19th century music, 19th century operettas. Similarly, in Act 2, her solo Love is a Plaintive Song is quite a lilting and conventional waltz, which quite possibly Sullivan thought would appeal to the romantics in the audience. And here, Mary Hegarty is singing Patience.
Love is a plaintive song, sung by a suffering maid, telling a tale of wrong, telling of hope betrayed, tuned to its changing note, sorry
final principle that needs mention is Lady Jane. And in this recording I'm about to play, the singer is Jill Pert, who, complete with her cello, is a distinctly mature and, dare I say, well-developed lovesick maiden. And is all the butt of Gilbert's ridicule. The cruelness inherent in her recitative song, Sad Is That Woman's Lot, is somewhat lessened by Sullivan's sympathetic scoring and some solemn notes on the cello itself. She bemoans the passing of her youth. Certainly at that stage in one or two productions I've seen, Lady Jane looks at the audience, picks up the cello in one hand, puts it over her shoulder and stalks off the stage. Now, I already mentioned, I think, that in Act 2 of Patience, most of the characters undergo personality changes as they seek to attain their ends. Bunthorne becomes far less aesthetic in his approach to life, and this is well illustrated by his very flippant duet with Lady Jane, So Go to Him and Say to Him.
Day to you, and that's what I shall say.
Your style is much so go to him and say to to him with compliment ironical.
Sing hey to you, good day to you, and that's what I shall say.
Your style is much too sanctified, your cut is too canonical.
Sing bar to you, ha to you, and that's what I shall say.
I was the beau ideal of the morbid young aesthetical. To doubt my inspiration was regarded as heretical, until you cut me out with your placidity medical.
Sing boo to you, poo to you, and that's what I shall say. Sing boo to you, poo to you, and that's what I shall say.
Sing hey, good day to you, sing hey, how do you, sing bah, to you, and that's what you should say. Sing hey, good day to you, sing bah, how do you, sing bah,
and that's what I shall say. And that's what I shall say. Bah, and that's what I shall say. I'll tell him that unless he will consent to be more jocular,
sing boo to you, and that's what you should say.
to cut his curly hair and stick an eyeglass in his ocular,
Sing boo to you, and that's what you should say.
to stuff his conversation full of quibble and of quiddity, to dine on chops and roly-poly pudding with avidity. He'd better clear away with all convenient rapidity.
Sing hey to you, good day to you, and that's what you should say.
Sing boo to you, poo to you, and that's what I shall say.
Sing hey, good day to you, sing boo to you, how do you, sing bah, to you, and that's what you should say. Sing hey, good day to you, sing boo to you, how do you, sing bah,
And that's what I shall say. And that's what I shall say. Bah, and that's what I shall say.
The comedy in Act 2 is continued when the soldiers try to become aesthetes and effectively turn themselves into marionettes. They complain that medieval art requires them to look both angular and flat. Now, some general observations must be made about the way in which Sullivan did set words to music. It's undeniable that at times he tended to write churchy numbers, but for theatrical reasons, he needed to end each act with something quite lively. He achieved that in Act 1 of Patience, where the finale lasts for about 20 minutes and concludes with all 10 principals declaiming at the top of their voices some rousing, and I would almost say Italian operatic style music. On the other hand, the conclusion of Act 2, which also involves a full cast, is joyful but arguably less successful because it's nothing more than a reprise of an earlier quintet. Now, given the special importance of Gilbert's words, it has to be recognised that there are many pieces of spoken quick-fire repertory that really do not need setting to music. For example, Archibald Grosvenor's wonderful mock heroic poem. Teasing Tom was a very bad boy. A great big squirt was his favourite toy. He put live shrimps in his father's boots and sewed up the sleeves of his Sunday suits. He punched his poor little sisters' heads and cayenne peppered their four-post beds. He plastered their hair with cobbler's wax and dropped half halfpennies down their backs. The consequence was he was lost totally and married a girl in the corps de ballet. However, perhaps we can finish off this bit of my talk by listening to some of the finale from Act 1. And even so, I probably need to mention that although the alternative title for Patience is Bunthorne's Bride, in the end, he's the only one of the principals not to pair off. in one of the better Italian opera houses. Shall we have a break for some tea?